At a converted racetrack complex in the suburb of Indooroopilly, outside Brisbane, Australia, in the spring of 1944, roughly 2,000 Allied soldiers sat at field desks reading Japanese. Many of them were Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, pulled out of their ordinary pre-war lives on the West Coast and in Hawaii and sent, sometimes with their own parents behind the wire of American internment camps, to work for an obscure joint intelligence unit called the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section. In front of each translator, every day, was a fresh stack of captured documents, stacks of them. Diaries, letters, pocket notebooks pulled from the tunics of dead Japanese soldiers on every island the Americans had taken so far. What those translators were reading, as a body of work, was one of the strangest archives of the 20th century. Over the course of the war, the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section would scan, summarize, or translate more than 2 million captured Japanese documents. When its staff distributed, translated intelligence reports to Allied commands, the paper volume would grow to something over 20 million pages. Much of that traffic was operational, unit rosters, order of battle data, captured maps, but an enormous share of it was deeply personal, diaries by the thousand, letters home that had never been mailed, pocket notebooks kept under orders, and pocket notebooks kept in secret from the men's own officers. And as the translators worked through stack after stack of those notebooks, a pattern began to appear. Whenever the writers had met United States Marines in close combat, the pages tilted the same way. The tone shifted, the hand shook. The language reached for something that Japanese military writing had never prepared it to describe. The Japanese soldier had been told before the war, by his officers and by his textbooks, by propaganda films and by radio broadcasts, that the American would not fight at close range. He had been told that the American was soft. He had been told that the American, trained in a country of department stores and jazz music and baseball, would break and run when pushed. He had been told all of this by men who had not yet met the United States Marine Corps in a place where neither side could retreat. In 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army believed it understood its enemy. By 1945, its own soldiers were writing in their private diaries that they did not. This is the story of what those diaries actually said. The ones translated and filed and stacked in archive boxes that would sit unread for half a century. The words of men writing in caves, in tunnels, in bamboo thickets, in the hours before a banzai charge or the hours after one, what they wrote about the Marines they were facing, what they wrote when they believed no one was reading, what they wrote when they had stopped believing they would survive to say anything at all. To understand what a dying soldier would write in a cave above a coral ridge in the autumn of 1944, we have to begin where the Japanese army itself began its war against the Marines. We have to begin with a confident prediction, made in Tokyo in the summer of 1942, by men who had never seen a Marine and were certain they knew exactly what one was. The prediction was made by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. He commanded a regiment called the Ichiki Detachment, built around the 28th Infantry Regiment. It had trained for the capture of Midway Island before that operation was cancelled after the naval defeat in June. In August of 1942, when the United States 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal and seized the half-finished airstrip the Japanese were building there, Ichiki was ordered south to retake it. The staff officers at Imperial General Headquarters gave him their best assessment. Japanese intelligence estimates of the American force on Guadalcanal ran as low as 2,000 men. Ichiki was given a first echelon of roughly 900 troops and ordered to attack immediately. He did not wait for his full regiment to arrive on the island. The actual size of the Marine force on Guadalcanal at the time of Ichiki's attack was closer to 11,000. Ichiki never learned this. On the night of August 21, 1942, at a tidal creek called the Ilu, which American maps mistakenly labeled the Tenaru, he led his men in a frontal assault against the dug in positions of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 1st Marines. The attack was crushed. His soldiers came through waist-deep water into overlapping fields of fire from 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister rounds. In the morning, according to the official Japanese account, Marines counted roughly 777 Japanese bodies in front of their positions. Ichiki himself did not survive. According to the Japanese official account, he burned his regimental colours before his death, though a Marine Browning automatic rifleman also claimed to have killed him in the final push. This is the starting point. Because it was not just that the Ichiki detachment had been beaten, it was that the Japanese army could not absorb the reason for its defeat. The Ichiki detachment had been trained in some of the hardest fighting in China and Manchuria. It had been told it was going against a department store army. When its survivors straggled back into the jungle with captured diaries and letters, they began to describe something else. A Japanese anti-tank gun officer named Genjirou Inui, a second lieutenant with an independent anti-tank company that landed on Guadalcanal in the weeks after the Ichiki attack, kept a detailed personal diary that was later privately published in Japan in 1992 with the help of his son. Inui wrote of realizing, day by day, that every assumption Japanese planners had made about the Marines on that island had been wrong. The beach had been held by far more men than anyone in Tokyo had estimated. The men had not run, the artillery had not stopped. And when the Japanese had reached the Marine line, the Marines had not broken in the way the manuals said they would. This was the first signal. It was not yet clearly read. In the weeks that followed, Japanese reinforcements were sent to Guadalcanal in fragments. A brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, roughly 6,000 men, was ordered to retake Henderson Field. In the second week of September 1942, on the ridge the Marines would later call Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge, Kawaguchi threw about 2,000 of those men in repeated night attacks against a combined raider and parachute battalion under Colonel Merritt Edson. At dawn on September 14, Marines counted upwards of 600 Japanese bodies on the ridge slopes and in the nearby jungle. Again, the numbers were wrong. Again, the pattern was wrong. The Japanese attackers, who had been told the Marines would panic at the sound of a banzai charge, instead walked into disciplined, sustained rifle and machine gun fire that cut them down in rows. Back at Imperial General Headquarters, the casualty reports from Guadalcanal were filed, discussed, and partially absorbed. The word went out that Japanese troops should expect the Americans to fight harder than previously estimated. But the fundamental assumption that the American soldier was morally weaker than the Japanese soldier was not revised. It could not be revised. To revise it would have meant revising the entire theory on which Japan's war plan was built, which was that a prolonged fight would not be necessary because American will would collapse. And so the same assumption was carried forward to the next island, and the next, and the diaries from each of those islands, collected later and translated, all tell variations of the same dawning recognition. To understand how clearly the Japanese army had misread its enemy, it helps to know the image of the American the Japanese soldier had been carrying in his head. On January 8, 1941, the Japanese army had issued a short document called the Senjin-kun, the Field Service Code, under the signature of War Minister Hideki Tojo. It told the Japanese soldier who he was and who the enemy was. The Japanese soldier was taught that capture was the deepest shame a man could bring on his family and his home village. Death was preferable to being taken alive. He was taught that the honor of his unit, of his ancestors, of his emperor, was carried in his every action. He was also taught, less formally but consistently through the training system and the wartime press, that Western soldiers did not think this way, that the American in particular fought for pay and for comfort, not for cause, that he would break under pressure, that he would surrender if given the chance. This was not a fringe belief. It was the foundation of an entire strategic doctrine. It was the reason Japanese planners repeatedly underestimated the number of troops required to hold an island. It was the reason they preferred the bayonet charge as a decisive tactic. If the enemy will break, you only need to push him. You do not need to outgun him. In the hills of Luzon in the autumn of 1944, an officer named Fukuzo Obara kept a diary that has been translated and studied by historians for decades. The document, later catalogued as Obara's Gekizen Notebook, was translated in 1976 by Edward Rasmussen at what is now the United States Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Obara wrote that the soldiers of his unit must now, as he put it, live the lessons of Saipan and of Guadalcanal. By lessons he meant one thing. The bastards, he wrote, using the Japanese word yatsura, must be taken and killed, ground to pieces, every grain of rice consumed for this single purpose. The language is that of a man who has been told for years that the enemy is weak, and who has now seen what the enemy actually is, and who is trying to reconcile the two. Obara did not reconcile them. His diary, which survived him, is the record of a man slowly losing the vocabulary he had been handed. He is not alone. The National Archives in the United States today hold hundreds of translated Japanese diaries from the Pacific War, scattered across Record Group 165 and Record Group 407. Read in sequence, they tell a single story. In 1942, the Japanese soldier writes about the Americans with contempt. In 1943, he writes about them with puzzlement. In 1944, he writes about them with fear. And in 1945, in the last months, he writes about them with a strange, exhausted respect that his own training had given him no words for. The first real collision of that kind came on a beach on the northern rim of an atoll called Tarawa. In the Gilbert Islands on the morning of November 20, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division landed on Betio, a flat triangular islet less than half the size of New York's Central Park. The commanding Japanese officer, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had reportedly boasted that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The boast is attributed to him in post-war Marine accounts and in the war diary reconstructions. He had, in fact, a garrison of about 4,800 men, counting the 3rd Special Base Force, the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, pioneer detachments, and Korean construction workers. He had 14 coastal defense guns, including 4 large guns purchased from British Vickers during the Russo-Japanese War, set in concrete bunkers. He had pillboxes roofed with palm logs and coconut palm matting, which allowed bullets to deflect rather than penetrate. He had prepared Betio, in his own confident assessment, as a fortress. Across 76 hours, almost the entire Japanese garrison died. Only 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Korean laborers were taken prisoner. On the American side, roughly 1,000 Marines and Navy corpsmen were killed, many of them waist-deep in water, held up by a coral reef that American planners had failed to understand was at low tide. The footage that combat photographers took of the dead at the waterline was so disturbing that the decision to release it was deferred to President Roosevelt himself. But there is a second story inside Tarawa. It is in what the few Japanese and Korean survivors said in interrogation and in the few fragments of diaries that were recovered and translated. Shibasaki, according to Japanese sources, had believed that his defenses and the ferocity of his men would be enough to break any American assault in the first hours. He did not live to learn otherwise. He was killed early on the first day of the battle. What his men did not account for, what the captured interrogation summaries from the Pacific Ocean Area's Joint Intelligence Center reflect again and again, was the refusal of the Marines to retreat once they had gotten even a single foothold. The pattern was reported up through the Japanese chain of command in the months after Tarawa. The Americans did not wait for orders. They did not pull back under fire. They came forward in small groups, 2 and 3 at a time, across open coral. They crawled over the bodies of their own dead to reach the pillboxes. They poured gasoline through ventilation slits and set defenders on fire. The Marines on Tarawa later described this as simply what had to be done. There was nowhere to go. Behind them was the reef. In front of them was the island. Between the two, there was only the choice to keep moving. Inside a Japanese pillbox on Red Beach 2, after the fighting ended, translators attached to the 2nd Marine Division recovered paper fragments from the bodies of several defenders. The handwriting on those fragments, according to the official Marine Corps historical monograph on the battle, described watching the first wave of Marines come in under fire that should by any reasonable measure have stopped them. Men were falling everywhere, one fragment noted, but the line did not stop. The Japanese defender's training had told him what to expect when an enemy was hit that hard at the waterline. He was expected to pause, to reform, to reconsider. He did not expect the enemy to simply walk over his own dead. That was not how modern armies had fought in the defender's experience. It was how medieval armies had fought. It was how men fought who had decided, for reasons the writer could not name, that the ground behind them no longer existed. The phrase the Tarawa fragments reached for is worth pausing on, The writers did not praise American bravery. They did not praise American skill. They described men who appeared to have forgotten that retreat was an option. In the context of their own training, this was not a compliment. It was a diagnosis. It was among the first times, in the archival record, that Japanese defenders in writing expressed the suspicion that the American they were facing was not the soft enemy they had been briefed to expect. The American, in the language of those fragments, was something else. What that something else was, the writers did not live long enough to work out. There is something that does not fit the story we were told about the Pacific War. We were told the Japanese soldier fought to the last man because he was fanatical, because he had been indoctrinated, because he could not surrender. All of that is partly true, but the diaries, taken as a whole, show something harder to absorb. Many of these men were not fanatics. They were schoolteachers and farmers and clerks and fishermen and sons, conscripted in the last 2 years of the war, and given a rifle they had barely fired. They wrote about missing their mothers. They wrote about the taste of rice. They wrote about a girl in Osaka who had given them a charm to wear around the neck. They were ordinary men, writing in ordinary language, describing an encounter with something that was not ordinary to them. And the least we owe them now, 80 years later, is to read what they wrote and not flatten it into cartoons. If that matters to you, if telling this history honestly matters, a like on this video keeps the channel alive and lets the algorithm carry it to the people who need to hear it. 7 months after Tarawa, in June of 1944, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, together with the Army's 27th Infantry Division, landed on the western beaches of Saipan in the Mariana Islands. This was a different kind of place. Saipan was not a flat coral atoll. It was a volcanic island, about 47 square miles of it, with a central spine of mountains and a network of caves and ravines that made it impossible to map from the air. And unlike Tarawa, Saipan contained tens of thousands of Japanese civilians, primarily from the sugar industry. The fighting would be different, the diaries would be different, and the confusion in the diaries would deepen. The senior army commander on Saipan was Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, whose 43rd Division formed the core of the ground defense. The first diary entries from Saipan, captured in the days immediately after the landings, still carry the old confidence. Entries taken from 43rd Division soldiers describe the Americans as they had been described in the training pamphlets: rich, over-equipped, dependent on naval gunfire and air support because they could not fight as individual men. But the tone changes fast. Within a week, entries begin to note that the Americans were advancing in a way the writer had not expected, that small groups of Marines were slipping around strong points instead of throwing themselves at them, that tank and infantry teams were coordinating in ways that suggested the men at the bottom, the sergeants and corporals, were thinking without being told to think. A Japanese tank officer named Tokuzo Matsuya of the 9th Tank Regiment kept a diary during the battle. Matsuya was 24 years old. His unit was largely destroyed in a confused tank charge against the Marines on the night of June 16 and 17, a charge the veteran Marine tank officers said was the worst use of armor they had ever seen. Matsuya's diary was recovered afterward. The entries have been cited in Samuel Eliot Morrison's Naval Histories and in a number of later works on Saipan. In one of the last passages, Matsuya wrote that when the enemy came, he would take out his sword and slash and slash and slash at him as long as he lasted, thus ending his life of 24 years. There is no rage in that entry. There is only exhaustion and acceptance and a kind of quiet astonishment at what was coming. Matsuya had been briefed, like every other officer in the Marianas, that the Americans could be defeated at the water's edge. They had not been defeated at the water's edge. They had walked inland, and they were still walking, and the lieutenant had realized that the thing he had been taught about them was not true. In the final week of the battle, on the night of July 6 and into the morning of July 7, Saito organized what he called a Gyokusai attack. Gyokusai, a word that translates roughly as the shattering of the jewel, was the official term for a suicide assault. Roughly 4,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, wounded men from field hospitals, and armed civilians threw themselves at the positions of the United States Army's 27th Infantry Division and supporting Marine units. It was the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment lost 918 men killed and wounded, holding them back. Only 189 Americans from those battalions answered the next roll call, and still, the American line held. The charge was broken. The Marines and soldiers at the front did exactly what their training had implied they would do if the situation ever came to this. They stood. They fired until their barrels burned. They fixed bayonets. When they ran out of ammunition, they used rifle butts and entrenching tools. A United States Marine who had crept behind Japanese lines during the days before the attack, a man named Guy Gabaldon from East Los Angeles who spoke some Japanese from his childhood neighbors, would over the course of Saipan and the follow-on battle for Tinian go on to bring in approximately 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians, essentially by talking to them. He told them they would not be killed. He told them they would be fed. He told them, again and again, that what they had been taught about the Americans was not accurate. Hundreds came out of the caves. Hundreds more did not. Some, including civilians, jumped from the cliffs at Marpi Point rather than believe him. What was happening in those caves on the final days of Saipan was described by the war correspondent Robert Sherrod in a Time magazine dispatch in August of 1944. Sherrod watched from a destroyer offshore as families walked calmly to the edge of the cliff and dropped. He watched mothers holding infants jump. He watched American Marines in landing craft below try to save people who did not want to be saved. He watched, and he wrote what he saw. His dispatch ran under the title The Nature of the Enemy. It shocked American readers more deeply than any combat footage of the war, because it showed what Japanese civilians had been told about the Americans coming ashore and what they had believed. They had believed they would be tortured. They had believed their children would be tortured. They had believed because they had been told that the men in those landing craft were not human. The Marines in the landing craft were trying to save them. This is the pattern that the Allied translator and interpreter section began to notice across the summer of 1944 and reported up through the chain to the Joint Intelligence Center of the Pacific Ocean areas in Hawaii. The Japanese soldier and the Japanese civilian had been told the same story about the Americans. Both stories had been wrong. And the diaries of the soldiers, increasingly, began to say so. They described Marines as patient. They described Marines as relentless. They described Marines who, when they took a pillbox, did not leave men behind to celebrate. They moved on, always forward, always the next pillbox. They described Marines who dug in at night instead of drinking or shouting, who ran wire, who brought up water and flamethrowers and demolition charges, who prepared for the next day's fight with a method the writers recognized as the method of men who meant to finish a job. The question that began to form in the translations was a question the Japanese soldier himself had started asking in his own diary. If the American was as soft as we were told, why were my friends dead and his were not? And if the American was not as soft as we were told, what had we been told, and by whom, and why? Few of the writers lived long enough to answer. By September of 1944, the defensive doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army had changed. It had changed because of what the diarists had been writing and because of what the commanders on the ground had been reporting up the chain about the fighting qualities of the Marines at Tarawa and Saipan. The men in Tokyo had been forced to accept that the old doctrine, beach defense at the waterline combined with bayonet charges and moral superiority, was not working. It was getting thousands of their men killed against an enemy who did not fit the pattern. A new doctrine began to appear in the defensive planning of island commanders across the Central Pacific. The Japanese called it, in their own internal documents, Jikyuzen, attritional warfare. The idea was no longer to defeat the Americans at the beach. The idea was to bleed them for so long, in such rugged terrain, that the American public back home would grow sick of the cost and demand a negotiated peace. The first island where the new doctrine was applied in full was Peleliu in the Palau Group. The commander was Colonel Kunio Nakagawa of the Imperial Japanese Army's 2nd Infantry Regiment. Nakagawa did not defend the beaches. He put a single battalion forward to disrupt the landing, then held his main force back in a coral ridge system the Marines would soon rename Bloody Nose Ridge. He had spent months preparing hundreds of caves, some of them natural, some blasted out by Japanese mining engineers brought specifically for the work. The caves were connected by tunnels. some had steel doors. Some were layered, with one cave above the other on a ridge face, so that if Marines attacked the lower cave, the upper cave could fire down on them. Nakagawa had been given the same briefing as every other Japanese commander, that the Americans would break. He had listened to the briefing. He had then looked at the reports from Saipan and decided the briefing was wrong. On September 15, 1944, the 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu. Their commander, Major General William Rupertus, had told his men the operation would take 3 or 4 days. It took 73. The 1st Marine Regiment, commanded by Louis Chesty Puller, took such heavy losses in the first 6 days of fighting against the Umabrogal that it had to be withdrawn from the line. The terrain was an impossible landscape. It was not jungle and it was not desert. It was sharp coral pushed up from the sea floor, jagged and loose underfoot, full of caves and crevices and rat holes from which machine gun fire could come at any angle. The temperature on the surface rose above 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Marine canteens emptied. Water brought up in oil drums arrived tasting of petroleum and gave the men violent dysentery. Inside the caves, Nakagawa's men were also writing. Their diaries, recovered after the battle, have been studied by Japanese and American historians for decades. The tone had shifted again. The old contempt was gone. The puzzlement was gone. What replaced them was a kind of cold, arithmetic respect. An anonymous diary recovered after the battle, and quoted in a number of later accounts of the Peleliu campaign, captured the mood on the Japanese side just before the landings. "The enemy has planned to land," the writer noted. "Let them come if they are coming. Who is afraid of the Americans or the British? We will defend Peleliu." Within 2 weeks of that entry being written, the tone in Japanese diaries from the same unit had changed completely. Captured passages described listening to the Marines working below their caves at night. The Marines were not shouting. They were not wasting ammunition. They were digging. They were sandbagging their positions. They were running wire. They were preparing for the next day the way, one writer noted, Japanese engineers prepared for a siege. The Japanese word that appears often in captured Peleliu-era diaries, and that post-war Japanese scholars of soldier writing have identified as one of the recurring terms across the war, is kakugo. It is usually translated as resolution, or settled determination, or the acceptance of what is coming. Writers reached for it when they understood that the fight in front of them had no way out. The word does not belong to the vocabulary of victory. It belongs to the vocabulary of men who have done the math and who continue on anyway. In the Peleliu diaries, it appears in descriptions of the writers themselves. It also begins, for the first time in the archival record, to appear in the Japanese writers' descriptions of the Americans they were facing. By the middle of October 1944, Nakagawa was down to about 1,150 men. He had been inflicting casualties on the 1st Marine Division at a rate that had shocked senior American commanders. Admiral Halsey visited the island at the end of September and was nearly killed by a Japanese mortar barrage during a brief tour near the Umabrogal. The 1st Marine Division was withdrawn after suffering roughly 6,500 casualties across its regiments and replaced by the United States Army's 81st Infantry Division. Peleliu was not declared secure until November 27. Of roughly 10,000 Japanese defenders, only a small number were taken prisoner. Most of those were Korean laborers. Nakagawa himself, in the final days, burned his regimental colors, destroyed his command papers, and committed suicide in his cave. He was posthumously promoted 2 grades to Lieutenant General by a grateful Imperial General Headquarters. His last radio message, recovered in the post-war reconstructions, was brief and without triumph. "Our sword is broken," he reported, "and we have run out of spears." Then he sent the code word "Sakura, Sakura, cherry blossom," and went off the air. His death did not accomplish what Tokyo had hoped. The Americans did not lose heart. The next island would be harder still. But Peleliu marked something the diaries had been moving toward for 3 years. A Japanese commander had looked at what the Marines had done at Saipan, had built a defense specifically designed to bleed them, had executed it with great skill against an enemy that he no longer underestimated and had still lost. The conclusion on the Japanese side, from the commanders who read his action reports, was that the old assumptions were dead. There would be no breaking point for the Americans that could be reached by casualties alone. The only remaining question was how much Japan was willing to pay to prove that point one more time. If your father or grandfather served in the Pacific, in any unit, in any capacity, I would be honored to hear what they carried back in the comments below. The name of the island, the unit number, the one story they told, or the one story they never told. Those details are the real archive of this war. They do not live in the national archives, they live in families, and they deserve to be written down before they go with the last of the men who carry them. There is one more piece of this story that belongs here. It is the hardest piece to write, but it explains what the diaries were actually reaching for across the last year of the war. In February of 1945, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, later reinforced by the 3rd, landed on Iwo Jima. The island commander was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Kuribayashi was unusual among Japanese generals of the late war period. He had spent time in the United States in the late 1920s on attaché assignments, including duty in Washington and study with the United States Army at Fort Bliss in Texas and Fort Riley in Kansas. He had driven across the country. He had seen the factories of Detroit. He had written to his wife that the United States was the last country in the world with which Japan should fight, because its industrial capacity was beyond anything Japanese planners were prepared to imagine. He was considered a defeatist by the ultranationalists in Tojo's cabinet. He was given Iwo Jima in the summer of 1944, in what was widely understood to be a death sentence. Kuribayashi did something no previous Japanese island commander had done at scale. He read every available report on the American landings at Tarawa, at Kwajalein, at Saipan, at Guam, at Tinian, and at Peleliu. He read the captured Marine field manuals that his intelligence officers could lay hands on, and he concluded, based on what he read, that the old tactics would not work. He forbade large-scale banzai charges. He forbade defending the waterline at all costs. He ordered his defenders of the 109th Division, along with attached Navy Guard units totaling roughly 21,000 men in all, to dig. By the time the Marines landed, the island contained an estimated 11 miles of tunnels and hundreds of mutually supporting cave positions integrated into a single underground network. Kuribayashi's letters home, later published in Japan and translated by Kumiko Kakehashi in the English-language edition of So Sad to Fall in Battle, contain one of the clearest statements ever made by a Japanese senior officer about what he had concluded about the enemy coming at him. America's productive powers are beyond our imagination, he told his chief of staff, according to that officer's post-war testimony. Japan has started a war with a formidable enemy, and we must brace ourselves accordingly. That is the voice of a man who had done the reading his superiors had not done. Before the battle, Kuribayashi issued to his men what he called the courageous battle vows. 6 statements of commitment. The 5th of them was specific. We shall not die, it read, until we have killed 10 of the enemy. Each man, each defender, was expected to take 10 Americans down with him. They did not kill 10 Americans each, but they killed enough. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed on Iwo Jima. Almost 20,000 were wounded. It remains the only Marine Corps battle of the Pacific War in which total American casualties, killed and wounded together, exceeded Japanese casualties. The Japanese garrison died almost to the last man. Kuribayashi himself is believed to have died leading a final night attack on or about March 26, 1945. His body was never positively identified. His last cable home was a poem about regret at leaving his country undefended. And on the Japanese side, in the tunnels and caves of Iwo Jima, the diaries written in those last weeks are among the most valuable captured documents of the entire Pacific campaign, because by the time a soldier was writing his diary on Iwo Jima, he had stopped believing everything the propaganda had told him. He had watched his officers die beside him. He had seen the Marines in close combat, and knew what they were. The tone of the surviving Iwo Jima diaries, collected and filed by Allied translators in the months after the battle, is not hatred. It is exhaustion and clarity. Writers describe the Marines below them, attacking the same cave for days at a time. They describe water running out. They describe the steady shrinking of the garrison. They describe, in passages that post-war Japanese historians have drawn from a range of recovered documents, the recognition that the Americans were not going to tire and were not going to lose their will. Whatever these soldiers had been told about the enemy before they arrived on the island, it was not what they were seeing. And as the garrison died, many of them, in their last written pages, reached for the same kind of language. The Marines were doing their work. One translated passage put it, "The way men do work they have decided will be finished." The diaries we have from Iwo Jima did not mostly survive their authors. They were recovered by Marines from the bodies in the caves and handed up the chain to the Joint Intelligence Center. They are today scattered across the record groups of captured Japanese materials at the National Archives. They were never quoted in American wartime propaganda, because the American public of 1945 was not looking for complications. It was looking for victory. It was looking for a clean enemy. It did not want to know that the men dying in the caves were also writing about their mothers, about rice, about rain, and in the last pages, about a respect they had not been given the words to feel. But they wrote those pages. The pages survived, and they are part of what those men left us. So here is what the diaries actually said when taken as a whole across 3 years and a dozen islands and a vast body of translated material. They said that the Japanese soldier, briefed for years by his own government that the American was soft and would break, had met the United States Marine and had been forced to revise everything he had been told. They said that the shock was not the equipment, although the equipment surprised him. It was not the air power, although the air power terrified him. It was the men themselves. The Marines did not fight the way Japanese doctrine said Western soldiers fought. They moved forward in small groups without visible orders. They kept coming after taking casualties that the defenders' training had assumed would stop any unit. They dug in at night instead of drinking or shouting. They treated combat as work. They treated each pillbox as a specific problem to be solved, not as a moral test. They were not fanatics. They were not, in the words the diarists eventually reached for, driven by propaganda of their own. They were men who had decided that the job in front of them would be finished, and who were prepared to spend whatever it took to finish it. That is what the diaries said. That is what the translators at the Allied Translator and Interpreter section saw in the repeated pattern of captured material reaching them from island after island. That is what Kuribayashi, who had lived in America, had tried to tell his own general staff before Iwo Jima and had not been listened to. That is what the commanders of Peleliu and Saipan had finally been forced to accept after all their earlier assumptions died with their men. The honest verdict is this. The Japanese soldier of the Pacific War was not, on average, a less skilled warrior than the American Marine. He was often, man for man, more tactically patient. He was almost always more familiar with the terrain. He had, in many cases, been in uniform longer and had seen more combat. He had equipment that in certain specific areas, particularly at close range with the bayonet, was effective. He had, above all, a cultural framework that made him willing to die rather than surrender, and this willingness should not be dismissed as simple fanaticism. It was its own kind of discipline, and it cost the Marines dearly. What the Japanese soldier did not have was the thing his diaries eventually, slowly, reluctantly acknowledged. He did not have an opponent who could be defeated by shock alone. He did not have an opponent whose will collapsed in the face of high casualties. He did not have an opponent who believed that retreat was a live option once the beach was taken. He had, instead, an opponent he had been told he would not have, and by the time he figured out who that opponent actually was, it was too late to change anything he had been planning. The Marines themselves, most of them, did not know any of this. They did not know what was being written in the caves above them. They did not read Japanese. They did not think of themselves in the grand way the diarists were slowly learning to think of them. They thought of themselves as men on a job, in a bad place, for a country that had sent them there. They would have been surprised, many of them, to learn that they were being described in a dying man's pocket notebook with the word kakugo. Not every diary, not every soldier, but enough of them, across enough islands, that the pattern became impossible to miss. Most of the men who wrote those diaries died in the caves where they were written. Most of their names we do not know. Their pages went to Brisbane and to Hawaii, and then to Washington, and then to archive boxes that sat for half a century before anyone thought to read them carefully. They are not famous, they will not be read in schools, but they are the closest thing we have to an honest answer from the other side to the simple question of what it was like to face the United States Marines in the Pacific. The answer, which took those men 3 years and thousands of pages of private writing to work out, was not what their government had trained them to say. It was that they had been lied to about who they were fighting, and that by the time they understood it, the ones still alive to write it down were writing by candlelight in caves they already knew they would not leave. If this story gave you something to sit with, hit the like button. It is a small thing, but it is how channels like this one survive on YouTube, and it is how the people who care about the actual history rather than the cleaned-up version get to find videos like this one. Subscribe if you want more. There are archives full of the words of men who wrote down what they saw before they died. They deserve to be read. And every time one of them is read carefully, instead of being flattened into a slogan, something of who those men were is pulled back out of the silence. That is the work this channel is trying to do. Thank you for being part of it.